Chapter 12. The Wind. That night in ecstasy we lay awake, drinking in a joyous chorus. One great swelling song rose from the mangrove forest, with a shrill thrilling from the countless leaves in between gusts of wind. From the outside reef a thunderous roar grew hourly, especially when the tide came rolling in. Then from over the reef came broken combers to surge in little waves across the lagoon and splash on the tiny beach within a few yards of the tent. The tent door was wide open, gone were all the sandflies, blown far out to sea we fervently hoped. All was coolness and sound and sweet wind. We lay smoking, for Charlie had actually offered me some of his tobacco dried seaweed. I had tried to smoke dried mango leaves and grass, and as cigars, different varieties of porous roots, all poisonous stuff. But Charlie was obstinate enough to force himself to do something he disliked. Just to accustom himself to it, he made himself eat bits of shark and the flippers of stingray when sweeter fish were easy to hand. That night was a heaven-sent relief, mentally as well as physically. We yarned on the friendliest terms far into the night. Fervently I hoped we would remain so. And through it all was the knowledge that now the wind had come, the catch must come too. Next morning at daylight we rolled from bunk and stepped out onto the beach. A howling wind nearly carried us off our feet. Some of the lagoon mangroves were uprooted and were the sport of mad waves that swirled right in over the reef to toss their spray high among the torn branches now writhing above the beach. The coral sand was carpeted thickly with leaves, and the reef was blanketed in far-flung masses of foam. It was glorious. By Jove, won't the old ketch just bounce along in this breeze? Charlie, without replying, watched a cloud of white-breasted storm birds passing overhead, wind-driven at terrific speed. I hope it's not going to blow a gale. The ketch might not be able to sail at all. Charlie nodded out towards the reef. Even if they were fools enough to leave shelter, how do you think a boat is going to land in that? The cauldron on the reef thundered the answer. My heart sank. When the tide surged out, we hurried to our fishing. The coolness and relief had made us famishing. Birds were singing around the well. To be able to walk around bare-armed and bare-legged, our faces no longer plastered in mud, was heavenly. In holiday spirit we ventured into what was the unknown to me, Charlie's fishing ground. Mine was behind the peak, his on the other side of the hill. There the waters coming in over the reef to the lagoon swept on into the mangroves, but were very shallow at low tide. This inlet from the lagoon was river-wide, walled by the mangrove forest to the east and a thin wall of trees to the west. Along the sea edge of these trees the ocean was roaring on a huge esplanade of reef unknown to me. We waded up the shallow inlet upon its white sandy bottom, clean and pleasant and open to the sky after the gloomy mud creeks of the inner mangroves. Russet-brown sea-grass rubbed broad leaves against our legs, so that we trod warily lest some big crab or needle-toothed eel try a bite at our toes. To right and left, here and there, little creeks branched off into the mangroves, their gloomy recesses intriguing with the probability of big fish lurking among the mangrove roots. Presently we came to a broad cross-channel that spread out from the mangrove forest to run in the opposite mangroves and apparently through them and over the great reef into the sea. This channel, undersea grass, was a lucerne patch. We yelled and plunged forward simultaneously, too late, for the turtle sped past our very legs in a twisting dodge, his long snake-like head outstretched, his flippers working at top speed. Dodging our spears, he fairly skimmed over the grass tops, his broad carapace just cleaving the surface. In keenest disappointment we watched his escape. How beautifully juicy a steak from him would have tasted. I wish we could find a nest. Turtle eggs would be a treat. No hope, answered Charlie. This island is all coral. The turtles like to lay in sandy beaches. Only a stray comes here. We might get a dugong. No chance. We'd need a harpoon if we saw one. I wonder what they ate for breakfast in Cooktown this morning. Fried eggs most likely, with bacon and potato chips, bread and butter and coffee, toast for them as like it, and a row with the missus as like as not. This is as likely looking creek for fish. Charlie waded towards an opening in the mangroves. We speared our fish in the little side creeks where fish were plentiful, all nice and cozy in the still pool so sheltered from the now raging storm outside. It came to us a gust of wind with a distinctly increasing roar from the surf. We waded along and picked the fish out as they lay pressed against the roots, just one quick jab with the spear. We seldom missed. Our eyes were rapidly growing, accustomed to the deceptiveness of the water and the merging of the fish's skin with the bark root against which he was sheltering. "We've got plenty now," said Charlie, as he hung a wriggling butterfish on his belt. "What if we have a stroll along the reef before the tide comes in?" As we pushed through the outer mangrove fringe, the wind fairly took our breath away. The tops of the trees there were being lashed down onto the coral, easy to understand now why nature in this extremely shallow soil had strengthened their grip by giving them so many roots. Their dwarf trunks with tough, thin limbs grew small, tough leaves that offered little wind resistance. They had to be tough trees to survive, and they were tough, defying both wind and sea. Now we had to shout to be heard above the thunder of the reef. As far as the eye could see, the broad reef was one tumbling lather of foam, magnificent in sight and sound. We walked along it for half a mile, like walking upon the far-flung battlements of some mighty wall, which it was withstanding the siege of the sea for unnumbered centuries. Its surface was honeycombed with crowded pools that would be a wonder to examine on some calm day. Sticking up from the coral, rusted and overgrown with weeds, we came on the woe-begone fragment of a ship. The sea is cruel. Looking back, we could see above the trees the tops of the two little hills. They looked a surprisingly long way off. We hurried back, but before we reached the lagoon channel, a wind-driven tide was lashing at our knees. That afternoon the wind had increased to a howling gale, and for the next fortnight, without cessation, the island shores were walls of flying foam, even the shrieking wind half drowned in the pounding thunder. Clouds raced overhead. To climb up to the peak was almost impossible. A man would have been bowled over and rolled down into the sea. The long grasses were pressed flat to the peak's sides. The little birds rarely ventured from the scrubby patch and the sheltered side of the peak. When they sped down for water, they flew low, skimming the ground, and they skimmed the grass and flying back again. The days dragged wearily by. One night, while lying awake listening for a diminution in the roar of the breakers, we heard a piercing scream right over the tent, distinctly followed by the beat of powerful wings. What mad night bird was out in all that fury is hard to say. Its despairing screech almost froze my blood. I couldn't sleep, felt itchy all over, uneasy, and gnawingly hungry. If only we had some dripping or fat, we could fry fish for a change, and use the fat on damper as butter. I wished Charlie would say something. He was restless too, tossing and grunting. He had grown moody again these last few days, prowling away to his own fishing grounds, until I took the hint and went back to the mangrove forest. I hesitated to force conversation, lest he flare up or lapse deeper into the sulks. Slowly the night wore on. Ears grow acutely keen in such circumstances. Charlie was not restless through pain alone. "It's an irritable sort of thing," I ventured. "Can't you sleep?" "Grr," he snarled, and flinging off his blanket, jumped up and took it to the galley fire. In the light of the wind-blown blaze he knelt down and studiously examined the blanket. A wild-looking chap kneeling there with his hair all over his eyes and his shirt blown up over his shoulders. I wondered what had bitten him now. Suddenly he howled, and flinging the blanket aside, rushed into the tent, seized his clothes, and raced to the beach. He slung all his things into the little tumbling waves coming in from the lagoon. Whipping off his shirt, he followed them, bursting into a torrent of hysterical cursing. I was too startled to realize instantly what had happened. Then it dawned on me that there must be insects of some description in the blankets, of course. It was an overwhelming relief. For a moment it seemed that Charlie was a lunatic. I laughed and chuckled for quite a time, then collected the blanket and a few rags and took them to a tree near the galley. Shook the blanket in the wind, then turned in under a tree. I didn't envy Charlie standing out there in the dark, cold water, with broken branches sliding against his legs, not to mention clumsy seaweed and coral and stuff. Suddenly he dashed back to the tent. In a trice he had it and the fly unrigged and flung into the water, threw all our things out into the dark, and made a bonfire on the spot where the tent had been. I watched in growing anger. It would have been laughable had we not been just two men quite alone. I tried to distinguish whether it was temper or something more serious that had so upset him. Suddenly he realized that the waves were tossing his clothes all over the beach. With a yell he chased them, a wild brown figure in the light of the wind-blown bonfire. Vindictively, I almost felt sorry that the sandflies had gone.